We are again at the B'nai Torah congregation in Toronto and continuing on with our series on Kabbalat HaTorah. And tonight's series, I forget the exact name of it, is Something Everything Everyone Else Refused. Just to remember where we've gotten up to right now. What we have sort of the structure we understand here is that on one side there's a concept called Kabbalat HaTorah, which implies that there's some type of acceptance, acquiescence. This is to be contrasted to the concept of imposition, which is usually the concept that we generally have of the word of God in humanity, that God imposes or orders, which is an imposition. Someone outside orders you to do something. It's not a reflection of your will. So the fact is that general understanding, if you think in terms of general religious perspectives, is that God commands. The fact is that when you talk in terms of Kabbalah, you're saying that the Jews agreed. You're actually talking about contractual relationship. It's no longer just God commands. It is that we agreed to it. You know, it's like negotiations, and then this is the conclusion we got to. I don't know if there were negotiations, but this was the contract, and God said, and we. Well, but it is a contractual statement. It's a statement that says, "I'll agree to this." It's not a position of zera. Now, the fact is, what we've looked at is we looked at the first medrash we looked at, well, the first Agadata was a Agadata of Kofale and Harkagigas, which is raising a mountain over the Jewish people. The point is that would seem like an imposition. God's commanding. But the fact is the Gemara says, Moda Rabba Lo Raita, says that there would be a tremendous challenge against Torah, against our need to observe Torah, because we only agreed under duress, because we were being forced. And the Ramban specifically points out that if you were talking about Gzeres HaMelech, about a decree of God, then what would be the challenge? The king said, that's it. The point is, it's a matter of agreement. So the question is that if it's an agreement, there was agreement under duress, there's an inherent fault in the agreement. So the Gemara says no, but then they agreed again at Purim. But the point is that one of the questions we raised was the fact that, you know, what's God doing, creating a situation, like the Gemara seems to say there's an inherent fault in the contractual relationship, but it's God who's creating that inherent fault by creating duress. So God doesn't know that there's a fault in the agreement, so it seems to be that God wanted to create a situation that there's an agreement, but there's a problem in the agreement.
Where is the duress?
Because if you don't do it, God will drop the mountain over you.
Ah, okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. The Medrash says that God raised the mountain over the Jewish people and said, you do it fine, you don't do it, we're gonna drop the mountain over you. Shamtiat Kurascha. This is where they're going to die. So the point is that you see this aspect of some aspect of imposition, but there's also this aspect of acquiescence, of agreement. And the major statement of agreement is the idea we looked at last time, was the statement of Nasa v'Nishma. And in that statement of Nasa v'Nishma, what exactly is the workings of that statement? Because it was just simply that they agreed to do it. God said, I'd like you to do this. And you say, yes. Then all they had to say is Nasa. They didn't have to say Nasa v'Nishma. Say, we agree. And in fact, we read a Ramosha where he says, listen, if that was the only issue, then just saying Nasa would be even greater than saying Nasa v'Nishma. We agree. We're going to do it. God, you say to do it. We're going to do it. So the point is that it seems to be from the Agadata in Shabbos that Nasa v'Nishma has significance because of the Nishma aspect as well. It's not just that they said do before they would listen or they would understand or so forth, but nishma itself has a value in what they're doing. In other words, the Gemara says they got two crowns, one keneged nasa and one keneged nishma. Saying nishma has value. Okay, so it's not just that they put nasa before nishma, that was one value, that was great, but they also said nishma. So they understood.
Nishma means I will listen, doesn't mean I will understand.
So that's a good question. What does nishma mean? Okay, so the point is that nishma seems to be I will listen. If it just means I will listen, well, you got to listen what to do before you know what to do. So it can't just mean listen. So the fact that because
I agree.
Whatever
you tell me to do, I'll do.
But then
tell me what you want me to do.
Okay. The fact
But
is
you also have not
And it should have
said.
been reversed. Nishma.
Well, nishma. If nishma is just I'll listen, I'll hear what you have to say, and I'll do it. The point is they're saying I'll do it, and I'll hear what you have to say. Of course, you have to hear what's going to be said, because you're going to do it. So the fact is, in Meforshim, there's a whole variety of Meforshim of what nishma really means. Okay, in terms of understanding what the process is. So one aspect of nishma, Rashi says that nishma means that you go through a process of figuring out whether you're able to do it. In other words, the person asks you to do it, you say, listen, let me figure out if I can do it. You know, I have to dunk a basketball. What do you say? Can I dunk a basketball? Well, if I can, then I'll do it. But if I can't dunk it, but maybe I can't dunk it. So Rashi says it's a matter of figuring out whether you can do something before you do it. But then he said, if that's true, what was the point of saying nishma afterwards? You've already agreed to do it, so what's the value in the process of figuring out that you're able to do it after you've already agreed to do it? And that's what we've basically pointed out. We pointed out various different people trying to understand what nishma is about, and it seems to be that it is a process that they have to go through. Moshe says, Moshe's perspective is that the nasa does not have clarification what you actually have to do, right? Because there's a halachic process. So he understands. A lot of Meforshim would say that nishma is about limud Torah. So nasa means I'll do, and nishma means I will learn to understand what I have to do. And that itself is a commitment to the study of Torah. And in Ramosha's perspective, is actually a strong intellectual exercise. Ramosha, in his Akdama to Igros Moshe, asked the question, why didn't God simply tell us what to do nice and simply? Because why didn't God just here's the laws, blank, 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 nice and simply. And he says that his answer is that God wanted us to work it out and think through concepts and ideas to come to the conclusions, and that's why Ramosha basically says that the objective is for you, based upon learning and dedication and intensity and thought and so forth, to come to the conclusion, even if you don't get it right, kalpei shmaya. Even if you don't have it absolutely, but you think this is correct, that's what God expects of you.
The first week you talked about Nasa and Nishma being all in the Torah Shebiksav.
No,
if you're getting into now,
you're right.
Torah
No. I said no. It's the other way around. No, I said that there is I think a Tosefta that asks the question because of the Koifleim Harkagigas that they raise the mountain over their head. The Tosefta gives that they agreed to Nasa Nishma was said in response to Torah Shebechtav, and that's why they didn't want to accept Torah Shebal Peh. That's why they had to raise the mountain over their head. That's a Tosefta or Tanchuma. The fact is that I don't really understand that Tanchuma, because the truth is, and I think that most of the people who comment, when commenting this way, pursuing to Nasa and Nishma, are not applying the concept of the Tanchuma. Okay, so I mean you're right. The Ramosha would not say the Nasa and Nishma was for Torah Shebechtav. It was specifically a lot of people say that Nishma is an aspect of Limud Torah, that we agreed to learn Torah. Rabbi Yoshe Ber says Nasa is the intuitive acceptance of God, and nishma is the intellectual acceptance of it. In other words, God says to do it. We have a thing that he you know, that we're going to do it. It's almost intuitive. He says it's a Ratzon Elyon, and then there's a Ratzon Tachton, which is our own intellectual investigation. That will come later. That's the Nishma aspect. Now, I ended up last week with the Gemara and Shabbos about the Saduki, and that really leads into this week. Gemara and Shabbos said there was Saduki. There was a case of, and let's just look at it quickly. It's item number it's item number 25. Okay.
Just the previous page.
Just go back. Yeah, it's the previous page. It's actually 2 pages previously. Item number 25. Okay. So the fact is, I'll just read the English crib notes very soon. He says there was a certain Sadducee who saw Rabbi engrossed in his studies while the fingers of his hand were under his feet, and he ground them down so that his fingers spurred blood. This is Encino translation. That's why it's this Encino translation. Okay. And the Saduki said to Rabbi, "You rash people who gave precedence to your mouth over your years, you still persist in your rashness. For you should have said, Nishma, he should have said, if it's within the powers, I accept it. If not, I won't accept it," which is the way Rashi understands it, right? In other words, you guys are rash. You immediately jump into saying yes. Should have checked it out first, and that's what he's saying. Rabbi, listen, you're rubbing your fingers. You're rash. You're not thinking. Thinking people would sit there and say, "Can I do this?" and so forth, rather than doing it. So Rabbi responds by quoting a pasuk, and really what he says is that, you know, if you see that he says, I mean, the Hebrew is Tomei B'Yisrael Tanachim. He says basically, we trust in God. God's not going to tell us anything that's not good for us. So therefore, and if you think of it that way, it becomes who's really rash, and that's why I ended up with a statement from Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, former Rosh Yeshiva in Baltimore, where he basically says, listen, if you trust in God that He's going to do good for you, this is not exactly what he says, but he's basically saying that if you trust in God that He's going to do for you, then it would be rash not to do it. Someone comes up to you who you believe has your best interest in heart and tells you to do something, right? You're not exactly sure why, but if you think this, if you believe strongly this person has the best interest in, you know, you'll do it. Okay, so the point is that the Saduki is saying you guys are being rash because you didn't check it out, and what Rabbi is saying is, listen, we trust God, so if He tells us to do it, we're going to do it, and it'll actually be foolish not to do it, right? Okay, so there's a tension there. Absolutely.
Kabbalat HaTorah.
Right.
I mean,
right.
Is what to trust.
Absolutely. Totally. I mean, Vayaminu B'Hashem.
Necessarily so rash.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly what Rabbi is answering. Vayaminu B'Hashem and Moshe Avdo. They accept, and that doesn't mean they believed it. Like, you know, I believe. It means that they trusted. They understood that this was in our best interest. Okay, you believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a Tov V'Meitiv, then the stupid thing is to say, I'm not going to do it. So the thing is that tension that is being presented in that Gemara is an interesting tension. The Saduki basically says, did you check it out? Okay, you didn't check it out, that's rash. The Rabbi is basically saying, we trust in God. But now becomes an interesting aspect of what Nishma is about. Okay, the interesting aspect of Nishma is that even though we trust in God, we'll still check it out. Right? Because that's what Rashi says. Yeah.
But your earlier idea that, okay, we trust in God, and we're going to accept, but we still have to hear it. Not that we don't trust, but that we have to hear it because we can't do it unless we know what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, but they say, but the nishma is not just hear it. Obviously, we just have to hear it. But but Rashi says it's a process of understanding that we can do it. So the fact is that that aspect of Nishma is an idea that we agree to do it because we trust in you that whatever you tell us to do is a good thing for us. But now I have to go through. Now I still have to understand it for myself why it's a good thing. Okay, and that's significant. In other words, if within the context, I think what Rabbi is introducing over here, within the context of the Kodesh Baruch Hu is a Tov V'Meitiv, if you believe that someone cares about you and he has absolute knowledge and says this is what you should do, right? That's what you're going to do. Okay? Based upon trusting of that person. The question that exists is that then you have any obligation to figure it on your own even afterwards. Okay? And it seems to be that what comes out from Nishma is an aspect of, even though we trust in God for making this decision and we will do it, because that's the smart thing to do because we trust in God, we still have somewhat of an obligation to try and figure it out.
If you may have that obligation, but I don't think how it applies to Nasa.
Okay, so that's a good question to start this section. Okay, that's a good place. What does it do in reflecting on the Nasa? Because it's asking about a shift in Nasa. So let's look at this famous story. Okay.
We're back on 4.0.
We're back on 4.0. Okay. Number 29. Okay. V'yomer Hashem misinai ba v'yazarach misir lamo hofi mihar paron. Okay. Shenigla hamakol nitein Torah liyisrael. When God wanted to give the Torah, lo al Yisrael bilvad hu nigla, ela al kol umos. Okay. He doesn't just offered it to the Jewish people. He offered it to all the nations in the world. Okay. Al kol umos. Betchilas halach etzu b'nei Yosef. So he went to Bnei Yosef. For Amr Lehem, Mekablim Atem et Torah, and he says, do you want to accept the Torah? Amr Lo Maksiba. So they said, okay, what's in it? Right? They went through the process. What's in it? I want to know what's in it. Okay. Amr Lehem Lo Tirtzach. Says, don't kill. Okay. Amr Lefonav, Rabbana Sha'olam. So he says, wait a second, God. Kol Atma Sha'osa Avihem. Everything about our father it's what Seichu. Shenemar v'ayadayim b'dei Yosef. Okay, so the point is Hiticha avi shenemar al karbo chatichya. We're all about killing. So how can you tell us don't kill? We're all about killing. Okay. So Kodesh Baruch Hu goes halacho etzel b'nei Ammon or Moav. So he went to Ammon or Moav. Amr lahem mekabel es Torah. We accept the Torah. Amr lo maksuv bo. Says what's in it? Okay, Amar Lehem lo sinaf. Okay, which in this sense is not to commit any form of incest. Okay. So the point.
Why is a different example used each time?
That's a very good question. Now think about the examples. Okay, because there's even beyond that. Why does he say that example? And there's even another question. Okay, that's built upon all the examples. It says, "Losinav Amr Lofanu Rabbeinu Shalom Kol Atzma Shel Erva Shalehemhi." Says, what are you talking about? We're all about Erva, because Ammon and Moav were the children of Lot, right? And Lot's daughters. So therefore, it's all about incest. Tarenev Shtei Benos Lot Me'avihem.
Also,
right?
it's connected to who he's talking
So hey, what are you talking about? That's who we are. Which is exactly what Ace is. Who we are. We're Rotzchim. Who we are. We're all about promiscuity. Halach v'matzah b'nei Yisrael. Then Kodesh Baruch Hu went out there and found the Ishmaelites. Amar lehem mekablim etem es Torah. So he says, will you accept the Torah? Amar lo ma kasuv ba. So what is it written is? Amar lehem lo signov. Don't steal. Amr Lefon of Rabbeinu Shalom, God, Kol Atmo Shalavim Listim Haya. Everything about who we are is being a ganef. Shenemar Hu Poro Adam. So the point is that God went to all these nations and said, And they said, what's in it? And God specifically took, as you're correct, a command that seems to go contrary to their nature, right? Okay, and saying, that's who we are. How can you tell us not to do? That's who we are. Okay, then he went to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people said, Nasa v'nishma. Okay, so one of the issues is that why does God specifically tell them something that is contrary to their personality? But there's another question involved. 3 sins involved are, as mentioned here, are don't commit murder, don't steal, and incestual prohibitions. Right? Now, who else are commanded in those 3 commands?
Everybody.
Everybody. They're all part of Shem Mitzvah B'nai Noach. So, B'nai Esav, B'nai Ammon and Moav, and B'nai Yisrael are already commanded in this. So, we're already by these laws. So, we're not law-abiding citizens. What do you want from us? We already violate these laws, but they're all part of the Noahide laws. So, why is God specifically taking Noahide laws? Okay, as examples, and
as opposed to Jewish laws.
Yeah, say it says in it, don't have Big Macs. Okay, I like Big Macs, so Okay, so the point is that why specifically those ideas? They're all bound by the Noahide law.
Anyway.
Okay, but anyway, okay. So that leads to the issue of what difference is there in the rules of Torah. Now,
if the Jews, when God went to the Jews to say, will you accept the Torah, and they said, Nasa v'nishma,
right.
Was it after they had already on the other 3?
Yeah.
So, they already knew that.
Did the Jews know that God went to all the other nations? I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, the fact is that there's a Gemara. I skipped over this Gemara, but the Gemara in Avodah Zarah points out. He says, "What are you upset with us for not accepting the Torah?" The Ummos Ha'olam in the future will say to God, "Why are you upset with us for not accepting the Torah? You didn't raise a mountain over our head." Or to say it another way, you didn't take us out of Egypt. I mean, the fact is that the acceptance of the Jews were already. They had reason to trust God. They were just saved by God. So the point is, it's not exactly a fair situation as a pure idea. But the fact is that that's why when you learn midrashim like this, it's like, what do they really mean? If God went around to all these other nations, like the Jews were all in one place. They were at Har Sinai, so they could all say Nasa v'nishma because they're all in one place. But if God went to B'nai Yishmael, where exactly was B'nai Yishmael? And they weren't in one place. So whether the Medrash is actually saying something literally or something to ponder, it's presenting an idea that and it's pointed out in the Gemara that the non-Jews weren't following the Noahide code anyways, right? So that's why the Gemara of Avodah Zarah basically says that their tainas against not being able to accept Torah are really weak because they weren't good followers of the Noahide code anyways. So how could they complain about not having Torah? You weren't doing what you were already supposed to do anyways. But the point is, it reflects some type of concept here. And what's happening here is that what's being presented here is an idea that with Torah, God basically says to them something which is contrary to the very essence in terms of their psychological being, and that becomes an issue in the sense that maybe yes, maybe no, whatever. But the point is that they say, hey, it's totally contrary to who we are. So how can we do it? And the Jews, by saying Nasa v'nishma, I heard one person once say very simply, because to the Jews it was very clearly who they were. right? They wanted to be close to God, or whatever. Some people say, you see, this is an indication that the Jews are, their personality is to pursue God and pursue spirituality. But the point is, if that's true, then the only difference between Jews and non-Jews is simply their personality. In other words, the acceptance of the Jews is not something that really stands out.
Maybe that's actually the issue. You go to the Goyim, it says you're not even taking Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noah.
So that's true in terms of Mitzvah B'nai Noah. But what I'm trying to point out also is that if you simply say that it's a Jewish way to... Now, the Jew wants to be close to God, and the reason the Jew said Nasa Minishma is because Esav wants to kill people, right? Yishmael wants to steal people. Jews are different because they want to be close to God, so that's why they said Nasa Minishma. Then it's basically an aspect that Jews are different inherently and created that way. So what's the greatness of their Bechira? What's the greatness of their investigation? You were created that way, you know? This person, do you want to go? It's like I constantly give the example to people, like, you go up to someone and say, I got, tickets right behind home plate in, for the 7th game of the World Series. How much will you give me for it? Right? Well, it really depends on how much you like baseball. Right? If someone really doesn't like baseball, the question is, how much will you give him to take the tickets? So the point is that if you say that that's the issue with Jews, so the Jews said yes because they were into it, right? Everyone else said I'm not into it, So that doesn't make it unique. If it's, in terms of because you were created that way. Okay, but I think we're going to see some other approaches. The Shuri Das. It's one of the.
But doesn't it always also raise issues as to why they said Nishma?
Absolutely. That's exactly it.
Who would undertake
exactly
this without question?
Right. Exactly. Because they understood this was good for them. This is something that they assumed. But the fact of the matter is, we're also now seeing the type of questioning. Rashi opens up the questioning of saying the questioning is, do I see if I'm able to do it or not? This medrash is introducing to us as a different type of question. It's a question of whether it's in line with your personality. Is it in line with your psychology? Now, I'll tell you something. Let me give you an example of this. I was going to mention a little bit later, but Professor Larry Kaplan from McGill has an article about the distinction between the Chazon Ish and Ramosha Feinstein. Okay? In the perception of the relationship of Torah to our human to our humanness, to our perception of life and so forth. Our basic human personality. He points out that according to the Chazon Ish, is what he feels is the Chazon Ish's perspective that if you're going to be a follower of Torah, you're not going to feel that you're not going to necessarily have a feeling of a good life. The Torah is contrary to human nature. That's really what I was looking for. Okay, the Chazon Ish felt that observing Torah is contrary to human nature. So that the person who observes Torah will not necessarily feel good in this world about what he or she is doing. And this sort of explains some aspect of Haredi psychology or something like that. But it's a matter that observance of Torah doesn't necessarily go in line with human nature. Rav Moshe held exactly the opposite. He held that observance of Torah could be the best way of expressing human nature, of meeting our human nature. So someone who is observant of Torah should have, in this human experience, a good life, can have a good life. Okay? So, and this was interesting because there was a little bit of an issue when Moshe was nifter about his biography. Okay, Art Scroll put out a biography of Moshe, right? So the truth is, I was in New York at the time, and where I arranged for Mordechai Tendler, Moshe's grandson, to speak on the first yahrzeit of Moshe about his grandfather. And he opened up by saying, the biography just came out of my grandfather, the Art Scroll biography. I have obviously bought a copy. I read it to my kids. It's a great storybook. And he says, but nothing to do with my grandfather. Okay, totally nothing to do with my grandfather. And the point is to really understand it, is that there's an English translation of some tshuvas of Moshe done by Moshe Tendler, Moshe's son-in-law, Mordechai Tendler's father, who's a biology professor, and there's a few tshuvas on medical ethics that he put out, the translation of Moshe's tshuvas. And in it, he opens up with a biography of Moshe. It's a very different biography. Like, for example, Moshe used to go for a soda with his wife in the evening. There's a little place down the road, they had soda, so he used to go for a walk with his wife, and they had a soda together. Okay? No one asked at that place, I can tell you that for sure. But the fact is that he spent time with his wife, and then he says, Moshe used to love to play with his grandchildren on his knees, right? And used to sneak in whatever, one of the issue papers to read what's happening. It was a much more human understanding of Moshe. And the way it sort of goes is that it's sort of like Moshe said. I don't know if he says its exact terms. It's like Moshe was very nice, very nice, old man. He just happened to be the gadol hador. He was like a regular guy. You just happened to be the gadol hador. That kind of perspective. That really tried to reflect that Moshe was really an aspect of human nature. He dealt with our human drives, and therefore there was an aspect of Torah enhances Torah can bring out, enhance our human nature, and we can have a good life following Torah. That seems to be the approach of Moshe. What Professor Kaplan argues is that was not the approach of the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish's perspective was that observing Torah is a challenge to human nature, right? Human nature will take you down that path of life, and if you want to have a good life pursuant to human nature, there's that path, but it's not the path of Torah. Okay, it's a very different path. Okay, now the point I'm bringing out here is that when you read this statement over here of this medrash, it's an issue arises is that they're looking at their psychology, and they're saying that their psychology is part and parcel of this dialogue with God. Okay? In other words, if you want to say you're imposing yourself, you're imposing upon us, so impose upon us, it's fine. That's one aspect. But if you're saying that I have to agree to it, and I have to and agreeing to it means that I see what I'm involved with, like why it reflects who I am, then that brings your psychology into it. Okay? Now, that's something that's happening over here. What's happening here is that what this medrash is saying is that with Torah, it seems to be that the Umas HaOlam believed that in deciding and accepting Torah, they had to have something where they had some understanding of its psychological perspective for their benefit. Okay? Now, that seems to be the perception they had of what Torah is about. Now, that leads to another issue. Okay, what a lot of people try to deal with is the distinction between the Noahide code and the Torah code, not just in content, but in the nature of the system. Okay? There are various laws in the Noahide Code that seem to point that in terms of procedure, the procedure is different. Okay? And the question is, what does that procedure, what's the distinction of that procedure? Okay, so the Shari does, okay, he presents an idea like this. He says that the acceptance of Torah can be argued based upon two different systems, or God's directives to humanity can be formed under two different guidelines. One guideline he calls Rofa Hamatzava Ala Chola, and the other one he calls Melech Hamatzava Ala Am. Okay? Now what's the difference between the two? Rofa Hamatzava Ala Chola, a doctor who commands a sick person. What he's pointing out is that there are two different understandings of authority, of what gives someone authority. One is the authority of knowledge, okay, which is what a doctor's authority is. He says, take this pill for your blood pressure. Okay? If you don't take the pill, it will affect your blood pressure. The consequence is inherent in the action. It's not that the doctor punishes you for violating the law. It's built into the system. And what the doctor's authority comes is from knowledge and saying this is what you should do. Okay. So there's one concept of Rofa Mitzava Ala Chola. Okay, that God is basically telling you what's best for you to do, and therefore if there's negative consequences it's because it's built into the system. Okay. Then the other one is Melech HaMetzuv Ala Am, a king who commands his nation. That's an external statement of authority. The king says, do this. And if you don't do this, you can have an external punishment, where basically you're being punished because of not because of the inherent structure of the command itself or the workings itself, because of the effect that it's the statement or the Gzeras HaMelech. Okay? Now, the truth is that distinction between inherent workings and so forth, there's different aspects of that distinction and so forth. One of the distinctions, for example, is the Rambam's distinction between Mishpatim and Chukim, right? Where he distinguishes two different types of mitzvot. Certain mitzvot, you're supposed to actually have the ethical perspective that goes with the mitzvah, right? Other mitzvot, you're specifically supposed to do it simply because God said do it or don't do it, and that you are not supposed to have an ethical perspective in it. Like, for example, he says a chuk. He says in terms of not eating something not kosher, right? You're supposed to look at that piece of pork and say, gee, I'm sure it tastes really, really good. You're supposed to see a non-Jew eating that Big Mac and say, gee, looks really geschmack, I'm sure you're enjoying it, right? I can't eat it because God told me not to. Not necessarily because there's anything bad about Big Macs, but there's an extended idea of God told me not to, and I'm not even, and according to the Rambam, I shouldn't develop those type of emotions to that type of thing. I should actually feel, yes, I would like to eat Big Macs. I'm sure it's fine to do Big Mac. God told me not to. Then there's other mitzvot that you're supposed to have a emotional response to, and feel there's something inherently wrong. So if someone's a ganef, you're supposed to feel, hey, no, it's wrong to steal, right? Not just, and you're supposed to have a negative reaction to it, in terms of, gee, this person's a thief. I don't want my kids hanging around with them, and you see this in terms of attitudes towards when someone does certain aspects of doing avera. No one feels that, you know, someone who's Machal Shabbos is a bad person, right? It doesn't have, but a person who's a thief, basically say, gee, maybe I don't want to hang around with him, right? Because okay, so there's that distinction. So the truth is that distinction, even according to the Rambam, it permeates all the mitzvot, where we're supposed to have some type of issue in dealing with mitzvot, where on one hand we're supposed to feel mitzvot come from the strength of the Gzeres HaMelech, and on the other aspect we're supposed to also find the Tamei HaMitzvot, which give an idea of why these mitzvot are the right thing to do. That's a tension that exists in the whole discussion of mitzvot, their intrinsic nature. Okay, so the point is, though, is what the Shuri Das says, what is the basic structure, or what's the basic authority principle in terms of the Noahide code and the Torah code? So he offers the following distinction. He states that the Noahide code is based upon Rofa Hematzava ala Chola, which is basically a matter that God has all the knowledge and gives you advice of what to do. Okay? But on Rofa Hematzava ala Chola, there could be exceptions. Like he points out that when it says the Avot followed Torah before Har Sinai, they followed Torah, but it was based upon the same principle that that people followed the Noahide code, which is Rofa Matzav al Chola. So he says that's why Yaakov Avinu married two sisters, because he made his own personal cheshbon that it's a matter of Rofa Matzav al Chola, and in this particular singular case, I figure out it's actually better for me to marry two sisters. Okay? In other words, I can find exceptions. Okay? And that he says is the whole structure of the Noahide code. Now, what's interesting about that is it actually answers a certain question. There's a famous Gemara about Hananiah ben Trajan, which is considered to be the source for the prohibition of euthanasia, which is one of the sources. Hananiah ben Trajan was being tortured by the Romans for execution, and the way he was being executed was he was burnt alive, but he had sponges wrapped around his torso to try and prolong the agony. His students said to him, "Open your mouth and let the flames go inside, and you'll die faster, because this is terrible, the agony." Hananiah ben Trajan says, "Can't do that. It's also." So it seems to be that even though he was in great suffering and so forth, he says, "I can't end my life even by minutes earlier than Hakadosh Baruch Hu's Gzera." Okay, so the executioner, the Roman executioner, sees this, and he's totally enthralled he's totally overtaken by the Sikas of Hananiah ben Trajan. So he says to Hananiah ben Trajan, "If I remove the sponges and fan the flame, right, will you promise me Olam Haba?" Okay, and Hananiah says yes. There's no question how Hananiah could have promised him and stuff like that, but the fact he says yes. So the executioner took off the sponges and fanned the flame, effectively doing euthanasia, right? Okay. So, and then the Baskel comes out that there's people who are Kona Olam Haba after their whole lives and effort, and some people are Kona Olam Haba B'Rega Echad, like the executioner. So there's a big question of how is it possible the executioner could have got Olam Haba for committing euthanasia? If euthanasia was awesome, how could the executioner be told it was okay, and why was it okay and for him to do it? So there's different answers to that. One answer is, since the executioner started the process of the murder, he could finish it up faster. He was a unique example. Another example is based upon this one. If the Noachide is only bound by Rofa Matzuva ala Chola in terms of advice and so forth, there can always be exceptions to that general rule. The executioner was an exception. Okay, so the Shem Mitzvahs B'nai Noach are not absolute laws like that in that regard. So that's one approach. That's the approach of the Shuri Das. But the Shuri Das then says that Torah is Gzeres HaMelech. Can't do that with Torah, which explains why Hananiah ben Trajan could not make the same cheshbon, because he was a Yid, he was bound by Torah. Okay, so it's a different aspect. His answer is Xeris HaMelech. Xeris HaMelech, you have to follow the law. You can't make these kind of cheshbonos. So the Noachites, when they approached the Torah, they were making the same kind of cheshbonos that they were doing with the Noachites. Maybe it's okay for me, it's my psychology, and so forth and so forth, but that doesn't work for the Jew. And the fact is, when they made that cheshbon of Kabbalah and so forth and so forth, they were still doing, Rofa Masuva Alachola, but the position of the Jew is Xeris HaMelech. That's the Shuri Das's argument. The big problem with the Shuri Das's argument in saying that is we've already seen that there's a problem with Xeris HaMelech in saying that Torah is built upon Xeris HaMelech. Torah is built upon Kabbalah. It seems to be that they had to make that kind of decision. And the Ramban basically says, if it was simply Xeris HaMelech, why do we have a challenge that there was a challenge in the Jews' acceptance? Okay, so the point is Ramosha then develops a very different approach. Okay, Ramosha's approach is that really it's a Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach that is really under the rules of Xeris HaMelech. They're really bound by the king's law. They're really Xeris HaMelech. And the reason they're under Xeris HaMelech is, and the truth is that actually there's reasons to see Ramosha's perspective. Like in the Noachide law, it seems the fact is the Or Sameach actually compares the Noachide system to the Bezdin HaMelech, like the king's court and the Jewish court, which basically did things for law and order, and this is the law. So Ramosha says the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach was under Xeris HaMelech. What happened was, and this is why he understands the Medrash. He says, under Lo Tirtzach, that's Xeris HaMelech, you can't kill. So the Jews said, listen, we understand under the king's law, we're not supposed to kill. But when you're asking us to do a Kabbalah, you're saying, what does that have to do with my being? I have to make a decision. So Torah is exactly the opposite. It's not just about Xeris HaMelech. Okay? It has to have something to do with your analysis and so forth. So Ramosha then develops this idea that says that the Noachide code is Siva Ba'alma. It's basically, non-Jews have to follow the king's law, what God commands. But he says that in the Jews, they have to accept the Torah as a aspect of when they're accepting the Torah, the way his language is the Sinas HaTorah. If you look at number 32, I'll just read it inside here. By the way, just in terms of, you might be wondering about this. If Ramosha rejects the Shuri Das's understanding of the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, of what the structure is, and he says the structure of the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach is Xeris HaMelech, it's a king's court. So how does Ramosha understand Chananya ben Shradya? Okay, why the executioner should be exempt, right? God said, don't kill. You killed. Right? Hanani ben Shradya already said that you can't kill even for euthanasia reasons. So why is the executioner get Olam Haba? What happens and so forth? So Ramosha comes up with a remarkable statement. Okay? He says, and this, I'm sort of pointing this up because people think the Noachide code and the Torah code are sort of like everyone talks about. We have 606 more mitzvahs. They have 7 mitzvahs, we have 606. That math is totally off. There's an article, there's a book out by Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, I think a cousin of Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, Zatzal was this literature, but he wrote a book called The 7 Laws of Noah, and he points out that if we were applying our Torah count of mitzvot, you'd have to say there's something like 40, 50, 60. There's whole big machlokas, but it's not just 7. Okay, what's grouped together in 7, if we break it up according to our mitzvahs, many more. Okay, but there are a lot of other distinctions. Moshe and there's one of the distinctions what the source of the law is. So Moshe says, wait a second, the prohibition of murder for Jews is from Lo Tirtzach, the Yisrael Sadirbot. But what's the prohibition for murder for non-Jews in the Noahide Code? What's the operative verse? It's a verse in Parshas Noach of Shofech Dam Hadam, right? If a person spills the blood of a person, his blood should be spilled. So Moshe then says, maybe under the Noahide Code, the prohibition is only for a violent murder done against the will of the one being murdered. Therefore, Moshe basically says, ulai, says maybe. Moshe basically makes a possibility that maybe pursuant to the Noahide Code, right, euthanasia would not be prohibited for a non-Jew. So he says, and that might be the reasoning of that's why the executioner was exempt. Because for him, being a Noahide, and the nature of its laws, maybe euthanasia is okay for non-Jews. Okay, because of the different source law and so forth. Which we find in certain situations. I mean, for example, in abortion, there is a distinction in law between Jews and non-Jews in the laws of abortion. Okay, so the fact is that the extent of that distinction is a matter of issue and so forth and so forth. But the fact is the Noahide Code is a totally independent code. Okay, but Moshe says that the Noahide Code is based upon Zeres HaMelech, absolutely God's as king. Torah needs a Kabbalah. So what does he say about this? What does the Kabbalah mean? So he says like this. Okay, and I'm sort of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, you see the word that begins, the line begins, the Sinas HaTorah, the giving of the Torah. This is item 32. Item 32.
Go on, Marie.
Okay? Sorry, when I made this I didn't do pages, I'm sorry. Ela the Sinas HaTorah he matana kazu shemish. What?
No.
Okay. Okay. The Sinas HaTorah he matana kazu shemishana et etzem gufa adam liot ben Torah. Says the giving of Torah is supposed to change a human being. Shekol ritzonotav v'hanosav, and all his being, right? Yehu kafi dinay haTorah, should be according to Torah. She'achdil is a kol tuvaso. Okay, then this should be what he's all about and what he really wants to do. It's basically, in lining what I told you before about Ramosha, it's an aspect of his human nature. That Torah is supposed to connect with your human nature, to refine your human nature, so that your human nature is fulfilled through Nesinas HaTorah. Basically, he has no desire for anything outside of Torah. Okay? Okay? Okay, b'kol hanasa guf b'amol yitchashu bo, inyan gadol b'chaya adu, yitchashu osher. In other words, he's saying that these things, wealth and so forth, he's saying these things by themselves should not matter. They're not, that's not what it's about. It's a matter of following Torah, and obviously, wealth and the observance of Torah can be helpful and so forth. Okay, so the matter is that he's saying that the Sinas HaTorah is not just the giving of a law, it's the fact that you have to accept the entire system, and through accepting the entire system, you are refining your personality. And the Kabbalah is that you want to refine your personality in line with Torah. Okay? Okay? Okay, so he says, Misha who came, a person who's interested in this and sees that he wants his life to be enriched through Torah, in line with his human nature. Hu b'chashivas Kabbalah matana chashuva v'yoser. This is why he wants this Kabbalah. So Kabbalat HaTorah is the acceptance of this form of shift of the human being in terms of human nature. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Okay, and then he says over there, Barak b'nasina kazu ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'sivim d'chol Torah kula. And only with this Sina, right, that God wanted people to accept the whole Torah. The Lord Tzivim b'Amar Kahad Design mitzvahs, and not just with some laws on the side. Okay, he wanted to accept. You have to accept the whole thing. So basically, what he's saying is the Sinas HaTorah is a matter of transforming your personality. It's a matter of seeing the value in Torah. Okay? And seeing it as an expression of your humanity and your human nature. It's the way I understand what Ramosh is saying. So the point is, though, is that now we understand what Nasa V'Nishma is about. Nasa is understanding that, the way I understand it, is that it's understanding that what God wants to do is really in your own best interests. And it's really the reflection of your own personality and the best way of coming to the ultimate expression of your personality. It's not contrary to human nature from my perspective. It is the greatest manifestation of human nature, and specifically the personality of every individual, the personality of Jews, and so forth and so forth. But the fact is now we understand Nasa V'Nishma. Nasa is the acceptance to get involved in the system. But the fact is you can't say that right there. The Jews could not say, I understand why this is good for me. Because they didn't know. Not just why I can do this, but I understand why this is a correct reflection of my personality. Okay? They couldn't they couldn't say that. Because the fact is they didn't necessarily know. The point is we don't know why all the mitzvahs are absolutely the correct reflection of our personalities. Okay, and there's a lot of issues with that. It gets into individual issues and communal issues and so forth. But the fact is that Nishma now becomes a process of understanding how Torah connects to you, how you integrate Torah into your being. Okay, and the fact is, it really comes down to that. In the end, it's not just a matter of doing it because God tells you to do it. There's a value in you understanding why you're doing it. Okay? And the point is that there's an understanding of what... And now, the truth is that we can never really fully understand, and there's a tension. And when I point out from Koifel and Hargigis, from the fact of mountain overhead, there seems to be still an aspect of Gzeras HaMelech, and there is an aspect, we talk in terms of halachic terms, of Gzeras HaMelech. So there seems to be this aspect of imposition that still exists. The fact is we do talk about mitzvot, commands. There seems to be this aspect that we are to try to understand, right? Which is to try and understand how this integrates into our being and really is the best way of the expression of our personality, right? Which is, what we're saying is, B'nai Yosef were right in asking a question. This doesn't seem to be in line with my personality. Well, that's the challenge. You should have understood that. You have to work to understand why it's part of your personality. The big question, and what I want to deal with next week, is why is that significant? Why is that important? Because what you're ending up with is right now, and I'm basically applying Ramosha's perspective, is right now you're ending up with that the entire humanity can follow the Gzeras HaMelech. And what humanity is, relationship with God is, God is king, you're in humanity, you follow God as king. There is a unique nation that accepted Torah, that has accepted the struggle, okay, of understanding why this system, right, really integrates with our human nature. And why this system should also be understood as a reflection of our own beings. Not just simply, even though we are also supposed to have this perception of Gzeras HaMelech. There's an aspect of Gzeras HaMelech, and there's an aspect of trying to understand. And that understanding is that perspective of trying to gain this understanding of how Torah really is an expression of ourselves. Right?
So does this explain, I'm saying this kind of tongue-in-cheek,
yeah,
but does this explain the politics involved in Nasa V'Nishma and my interpretation as opposed to you above or
in a certain way, okay. The fact is the concept of Shivim Panim the Torah is that every human being is different. Therefore, every human being's expression of Torah is going to be different.